JFK International Airport had a way of reducing people to their luggage. The terminals move the way crowds always move, with the particular indifference of a system that has learned to process bodies without registering them as individuals. Gate 47, servicing the overnight flight to Zurich, was different only in its lighting, warmer, more deliberate, arranged to suggest that the people boarding at the front of the plane existed in a slightly better version of reality than the people boarding at the back. Ethan Walker sat at the end of the first-class boarding lounge and held the same posture he had held for most of his adult life, still, contained, a man who had learned that stillness was its own form of armor. His jacket was dark and clean and had been purchased 7 years ago at a department store in Queens. The stitching at the left cuff had been repaired. He had repaired it himself at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night while Mia slept. Mia was sleeping now, her head against his shoulder, her breathing slow, and even in the way that breathing becomes when the body has decided to trust completely. She was 8 years old and small for her age, and had her mother's dark lashes and her father's particular stillness, as though she had absorbed the quality from proximity the way children absorb language. On her left wrist, just below the cuff of her sleeve, she wore a medical bracelet made of silver-toned metal. The inscription was in small block letters: Post, Transplant Cardiac Patient, Emergency Contact, E. Walker. Below that, a phone number. Below that, a list of medications and a blood type and a warning about specific procedures. She had worn it every day for 3 years. She had stopped asking what it meant after the first month. Around them, the first-class boarding lounge went about its business with the practiced ease of people who are accustomed to comfort and therefore no longer notice it. A man in his mid-40s stood near the window with a glass of champagne and a phone pressed to his ear, his cufflinks catching the overhead light at intervals. 2 women in business dress discussed something in the clipped shorthand of people who have been working together long enough to eliminate most of the connective tissue from their sentences. A flight attendant named Claire Dawson moved through the lounge with the particular economy of motion that came from several years of managing the expectations of people who believed that the price of their ticket entitled them to her complete attention. She noticed Ethan Walker the way she noticed anything that did not fit the visual grammar of the space. The jacket, the worn soles of his shoes visible when he shifted his weight, the sleeping child. She did not think of herself as a person who made judgments. She was also not a person who denied that she made them. She approached with her professional warmth fully deployed. "Sir," she said, "I just want to confirm your boarding assignment. Sometimes there are mix-ups at the gate." Ethan looked up. His eyes were dark and steady and held no particular expression. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced 2 boarding passes, which he held out without comment. Claire took them. She read them once, then she read them again. First class. Seats 2A and 2B. Ethan Walker, Mia Walker. She handed them back. "Of course," she said. "I apologize for the inconvenience." "You don't have to apologize," Ethan said. His voice was level and carried no edge. Claire returned to her position near the gate. She was still processing the exchange when the lounge's entrance opened, and Richard Kane walked through it. Richard Kane was 52 years old and had the physical presence of a man who had spent the last decade learning to inhabit rooms rather than merely enter them. He was the chairman and majority shareholder of Kane Medical Group, one of the 3 largest medical device and pharmaceutical companies in the country. He had been photographed for the covers of 9 business publications. He had testified before 2 Senate committees. He had the particular confidence of a man who has not been told no in long enough that he has begun to forget the word exists. He moved through the lounge with his assistant 2 paces behind him and paused near the window to accept a glass of champagne. His gaze moved across the room with the automatic assessment of a man who has trained himself to read spaces quickly. It landed on Ethan. Richard Kane's face did what faces do when they encounter something they consider out of place. It organized itself into an expression of faint amusement that was actually a form of contempt wearing different clothes. "Airlines really will sell first class to anyone these days," he said, not quietly, not to anyone in particular, but with the studied carelessness of a man who wants to be heard but prefers not to be held accountable for having spoken. Several people in the lounge heard. One man smiled. A woman glanced at Ethan, and then at her phone. Mia stirred at the sound of the voice. She blinked, turned her head, found her father's face. He was already looking down at her. His expression had not changed. "Did I fall asleep?" she asked. "For a while," he said. She shifted, pulling her arm closer to her body. The sleeve rode up slightly, and the silver bracelet caught the light. Claire Dawson saw it from across the lounge. She had seen medical bracelets before diabetic patients, allergy alerts, various conditions that required the shorthand of metal and engraving. She had never seen the specific phrase, post-transplant cardiac patient, on a child's wrist. The words rearranged her understanding of the last 5 minutes. She was still holding that rearrangement in her mind when the lounge door opened again and Victoria Sinclair walked through it. Victoria Sinclair was 37 years old and had the kind of face that photographers describe as architectural structured, precise, organized around the bone, in a way that photographs well and commands rooms. She was the CEO of Sinclair Biotech, a pharmaceutical development firm that had been valued, at its last funding round, at a figure that most people could not picture concretely. She wore a charcoal coat and carried nothing except a slim leather portfolio, which was the professional equivalent of a statement. She entered the room and it reoriented slightly around her, the way rooms do around people who have learned to expect that reorientation. Her gaze moved across the lounge in the habitual sweep of someone who reads her environment automatically, and stopped. The champagne glass she had accepted at the door was in her right hand. It descended slowly to her side. Then it tilted without her appearing to notice it, and the remaining champagne fell onto the polished floor in a quiet splash that several nearby passengers turned toward. Ethan Walker sat across the lounge with a sleeping child against his shoulder and his boarding pass in his hand, and the absolute particular stillness of a man who has learned that stillness is the only response to a world that has decided to keep moving without him. Victoria looked at him for a long time. Her face went through something that was not readable from any distance. The gate agent announced first-class boarding over the speaker system. Around the lounge, people gathered their carry-on luggage and adjusted their coats and moved toward the gate. Ethan woke Mia gently, and she rose with the practiced compliance of a child who had been woken from sleep in hospitals and waiting rooms, and borrowed time often enough that it had become part of her ordinary understanding of how mornings began. She took her father's hand. They walked toward the gate. Victoria Sinclair watched them go, and did not move, and continued not moving for a moment longer than was necessary. The board had not changed. The numbers had not moved. But in the particular silence of a first-class lounge at JFK International, something old had come back into the light. The man that Ethan Walker had been 10 years ago existed now only in the residue that large things leave behind. In archived hospital records and medical journal citations, in a handful of photographs that had appeared on the front pages of 3 major newspapers on a Thursday in October, 9 years before the night at Gate 47. In the memory of people who had watched something extraordinary come apart in public and had not been able to look away. He had been 31 years old when the photograph on those front pages was taken, and he had been standing outside a hospital in the rain in the particular posture of a man who has just been told what his life is now worth. The caption beneath the photograph had been a single sentence. It had been accurate in the way that sentences are sometimes accurate when they describe the facts of an event without the first understanding of the facts behind it. Dr. Ethan Walker had been, before that Thursday, the kind of surgeon that other surgeons discussed in the specific quiet of professional admiration that people in highly skilled fields extend only to those who make the skill look different in kind rather than degree. He had completed his residency at 32, ahead of schedule. He had performed his first solo cardiac bypass at an age when most of his colleagues were still assisting. At 30, he had designed a repair technique for a congenital ventricular defect that his supervising physician had formally submitted to a peer-reviewed journal with Ethan's name alone on the byline. He had met Victoria Sinclair when she was 27 and working in the pharmaceutical research division attached to the same hospital system. She had walked into a cardiology conference 3 minutes late and taken the last available seat, which happened to be beside him, and had then proceeded to ask the most technically precise questions of anyone in the room, including the panel. He had been struck first by the quality of her thinking and later, in the order that things develop when they develop honestly, by everything else. They had been together for 4 years. They had not talked seriously about marriage, but they had talked about the future in the way that people talk about it when they expect to share it. The patient had been a 43-year-old man named David Reeves. He was the father of a son and a daughter, and he had been on the cardiac transplant waiting list for 11 months. And when a compatible heart became available on a Wednesday night in October, Ethan had been called in to perform the surgery. The surgery had gone for 7 hours. Ethan had been at the table for all of them. The transplant was technically successful. The heart was beating. The patient was closed and moved to the ICU and placed on a standard post-operative protocol. By Thursday morning, David Reeves was dead. The official cause was recorded as acute rejection response and systemic organ failure. The investigation that followed examined Ethan's procedural record, his decisions at the table, his communications with the post-operative team. It found no clear error. It also found no clear explanation. And in medicine, when an outcome is catastrophic and the cause is ambiguous, the ambiguity tends to resolve in the direction of whoever held the scalpel. His medical license was suspended pending further review. The review took 9 months. When it concluded, his license was not restored. The finding cited concerns about professional judgment under pressure. It was the kind of finding that looks, to anyone reading it carefully, like a conclusion that had been reached before the evidence was gathered. Ethan left the hospital. He did not contest the finding publicly. He disappeared from every professional context simultaneously, and so completely that the people who had known him began, after a year, to speak of him in the past tense. What no one in that public account understood was what had happened in the 6 months before the surgery. The drug had a name, a long chemical name that had been assigned by a research team, and a shorter internal code that the Kane Medical Research Division used in its documentation. It was a post-transplant immunosuppressant being developed as a next-generation alternative to the established medications. It was in phase 2 of its clinical trials. It had not been approved for human use. It was not, by any legal or ethical standard, supposed to be anywhere near a transplant patient's medication protocol. The patient, David Reeves, had been enrolled in the trial without his full knowledge. The consent documentation had been structured in a way that obscured this fact. The enrollment had been managed by a research coordinator reporting to a division whose funding came substantially from Kane Medical Group. Richard Kane had known about the trial. He had authorized the acceleration of its timeline. He had read the reports indicating the drug's instability in certain genetic profiles and had directed his team to proceed. Ethan had not known about the drug. He had performed the surgery correctly. He had saved the heart. The drug had killed the man. None of this was in the investigation's findings, because none of it had been investigated. The records that would have shown the trial existed had been removed from the hospital's system the morning after David Reeves died. The research coordinator had been quietly transferred to another facility. The documentation had been restructured to remove all connection between the patient's post-operative care and the Kane medical trial. What remained was a dead man and a suspended surgeon. In the years that followed, Ethan had worked through the specific process of a person learning to live inside a diminished version of their life. He had driven trucks, because truck driving required focus, and rewarded it, and asked nothing of him that he was not capable of giving. He had moved to a small apartment in a part of Brooklyn that had not yet attracted the attention of people with renovation plans. He had paid his bills and eaten carefully, and done the particular daily arithmetic of a man managing close margins with methodical attention. He had also, 4 years after the suspension, met a woman named Sarah. She had been a librarian, and she had offered the same quality of attention to everything she encountered that Mia now offered to the world. They had been married for 2 years before her diagnosis. She had lasted 14 months. Mia had been 3 when her mother died. She had been 4 when her own diagnosis was made. She had been 5 when the transplant was performed, at a hospital in Boston, by a surgical team that Ethan had vetted with the thoroughness of a man who knows exactly what can go wrong and why. He had not been in the room for that surgery. He had sat outside it for 11 hours, with the particular quality of stillness that comes not from peace, but from the complete suspension of everything, except the act of waiting. Mia had survived. The transplant had held. He had been saving for Zurich for 2 years. The clinic there had developed a monitoring protocol for pediatric post-transplant patients that was not yet available in the United States, and Mia's cardiologist in New York had recommended it with the specific seriousness of a doctor who chooses his words precisely when the stakes are high. Ethan had researched it. He had called the clinic 4 times. He had booked the tickets on the day his savings account crossed the threshold he had set. He had bought first class because the lie-flat seats meant Mia could sleep without sitting upright for 9 hours, and Mia's cardiologist had told him, in the same precise language, that Mia's current cardiac status made prolonged physical stress, a category of risk that required consideration. This was the complete explanation for 2 first-class seats that had alarmed a flight attendant and amused a man with cufflinks. Ethan Walker knew this explanation. He did not offer it to the people who had looked at him in the lounge. He had long since stopped explaining himself to rooms. The cabin reached its cruising altitude over the dark Atlantic, and settled into the particular quality of quiet that overnight flights achieve when the meal service has ended and the lights have dimmed, and most passengers have retreated behind their eye masks and neck pillows into the private country of attempted sleep. Mia was in seat 2A, the window. She had eaten half of her dinner with the methodical attention she gave to things she considered obligations rather than pleasures, and then she had watched 40 minutes of a nature documentary about migratory birds with an absorption that suggested she was taking notes. Ethan had watched her watch it. This was most of what he did with his time, in the specific sense that it was the activity around which all other activities organized themselves. She fell asleep before the documentary ended. He turned off the screen and tucked the blanket more completely around her and sat back in his own seat and did not sleep. Victoria Sinclair was in seat 4A, 6 rows back in the same cabin. He had been aware of her position since boarding with the specific awareness of a person who cannot be in a room without knowing where a particular thing is located. He had not looked directly at her. He did not look directly at her now. He looked at the dark oval of the window above Mia's head and thought, as he did on most nights that had too much quiet in them, about David Reeves. He was still thinking about this when Mia made a sound. It was not a loud sound. It was the specific sound of a body encountering something wrong, a sharp inhalation that was half breath and half something else entirely. Ethan was turned toward her before the sound had finished. She was awake, her eyes were open, and her hand was pressed to her sternum, and her face had the particular expression of someone who is trying to determine whether what they are feeling is what they are afraid it is. "Bah," she said, very quietly. He was already unbuckling. He moved into the space beside her, taking her hand, noting the color of her lips, the rate of her breathing, the quality of her grip on his fingers. "Tell me what you feel," he said. His voice was completely level in the way that voices become when the person speaking them has redirected everything that would otherwise become emotion into action. "Pressure," she said, "and it's fast." He reached across her and pressed the call button. He was already timing her pulse with 2 fingers at her wrist. Claire Dawson appeared within 45 seconds. She took in the scene. Ethan bent over his daughter, one hand at her wrist, the other at the side of her neck, and understood immediately that this was not a routine discomfort. "Is she all right? I need to know if there's a medical kit on board. Specifically, whether it includes any of the following." He listed 4 medications in their pharmaceutical names without hesitation. He listed the dosages by weight categories. He listed the contraindications. Claire stared at him for 2 seconds. "We have an emergency medical kit. I'll get it. We also have a passenger in business class who may be a physician, a Dr. Marcus. I can ask him." "Please get the kit first," Ethan said. "Bring it to me before you get anyone else." She went. She returned in 90 seconds with a red case that she opened in front of him with practiced efficiency. He went through it with both hands, with a speed and organization that had nothing to do with the man in the worn jacket, and everything to do with a decade of surgical training that did not expire because a piece of paper had been revoked. He found what he needed. He prepared a small adjustment to Mia's existing medication, load a calculation that required no tools except the numbers he carried in his memory, and administered it with a steadiness of hand that made Claire Dawson, watching, briefly forget to breathe. Dr. Marcus, the physician from business class, arrived 4 minutes later in the disheveled competence of someone woken from sleep to be helpful. He took in Ethan's position over Mia and introduced himself and began to explain what options were available for cardiac events on long-haul flights. Ethan listened for exactly as long as it took him to understand that the man had general training and specific goodwill and was not equipped for the particular situation in front of him. "Thank you," he said. "I've addressed the immediate issue. What she needs now is monitoring and rest. The medication adjustment I've made will stabilize her arrhythmia for the duration of the flight." Dr. Marcus looked at him. "What's your background?" Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then, "Her father." He turned back to Mia. The other doctor stood where he was for a moment, and then stepped back, because there was nothing in the posture of the man beside the child that left room for anything except the specific work being done. Mia's breathing steadied over the next 20 minutes. Her color improved in the gradual way that color improves when the thing causing the problem has been addressed rather than simply managed. She turned her head toward Ethan and looked at him with the clear-eyed attention of a child who has been frightened and is now assessing whether she is still frightened. "Better," she said. "Better," he confirmed. "Your hands are shaking," she said. He looked down. They were. A fine tremor that began somewhere in the lower forearm, the delayed physiological response to adrenaline that a body holds until the crisis is over. He had known it was coming. He had been holding it back since the moment he heard her sound. "They do that sometimes," he said. "I know," she said. "I won't tell anyone." She said this with complete seriousness, as though they were conspirators, which was one of the ways she had of turning his worst moments into things that were almost bearable. Across the darkened cabin, Victoria Sinclair had not moved from her seat. She had not been asleep. She had watched the entire sequence from the moment the call light came on, to the moment the flight attendant returned with the medical kit, to the moment she saw Ethan Walker move over his daughter with the specific efficiency of a man who had trained for 10 years to save lives, and had never stopped being that man, regardless of what the licensing board had decided. She sat with this for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and began to type. The Zurich Heart Institute occupied a glass and concrete building on the northern edge of the city that had been designed to look, from the outside, like something that believed in light. The interior carried through on the promised corridors wide enough to feel uncrowded, waiting areas with views of the lake, a quality of quiet that was not the tense quiet of most medical settings, but the considered quiet of people working carefully. Ethan brought Mia in on the morning following the flight, which they had spent in a small hotel near the city center, where Mia had slept for 11 hours and woken asking about the lake. He had taken her to see it before the appointment, standing at the edge of the embankment in the early November cold, Mia wearing her coat and her medical bracelet, and the expression she wore when she was storing something for later. "It's green," she said. "Glacial water," he told her. "The minerals reflect light differently." She looked at it for a while. "Do you think the fish know they're in an unusual lake?" He looked at her. "Probably not," he said. "But they live in it either way." She considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then she was ready to go to the hospital. The appointment was with a physician named Dr. Yolanda Favre, who had been conducting the monitoring study that Mia's New York cardiologist had recommended, and who received them with the particular warmth of a doctor who has worked long enough with pediatric patients to understand that the parent's composure is also her professional responsibility. Ethan answered every question with precision and a complete account. He had brought documentation Mia's full medical history from the transplant forward, organized in chronological order with the procedural notes highlighted and the medication history annotated. Dr. Favre reviewed it and looked up at him once over the top of the folder with an expression that said she had questions she did not yet know how to ask. "You have a very thorough understanding of her case," she said. "She's my daughter," Ethan said. This was true, and it was also, as answers go, entirely insufficient as an explanation for the depth of the documentation. Dr. Favre noted this and chose to let it stand. After the appointment, while Mia was in a separate examination room for the preliminary monitoring study, Ethan sat in the consultation waiting area and looked at the lake view through the window for a long time without seeing it. He was still sitting there when someone sat down beside him. He had heard the wheels of the chair. He did not turn immediately. "Noah says hello," Victoria said. He turned then. She was dressed differently from the airport, a dark sweater, professional but not formal, her hair down in a way that changed the architecture of her face, from its usual precision, into something closer to what it had been 10 years ago. She looked at him with an expression he could not read easily, which was new. He had once been able to read her face with the accuracy of long familiarity. "Noah is here," he said. "He flew in this morning." She paused. "He's been here before, actually. He knows the team at this institute. He's been working on something for a while, Ethan." She said his name, the way people say names that have been held in the mouth for a long time. "Victoria, he never believed you were responsible." She said it without inflection, the way someone states a fact that has been held in private for so long that saying it out loud requires the stripping of all decoration. Not for one day. He spent 3 years looking for what actually happened. And 4 months ago, he found it. The waiting room was quiet. Outside, the lake held its green light. "The drug," Ethan said. Victoria looked at him. "You knew?" "I suspected. I had no evidence." He turned back to the window. "I suspected the morning after David died. Something in the rejection pattern was wrong. It didn't match a standard immune response. But I couldn't prove it, and I was already under investigation, and anything I said was going to look like someone trying to cover a mistake with a conspiracy." He paused. "So I said nothing." The cost of that silence lived in the quality of the pause that followed it. "Noah has the original trial data," Victoria said. "The data from before Kane's team altered it. He got it from the research coordinator who ran the study. She kept copies. She left the country 6 years ago and has been trying to decide what to do with them ever since." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Where is Noah now?" He's meeting with the Institute's director this afternoon. He wanted to show you the data first. She stopped. He's in the building. He said to tell you he'd be wherever you wanted to meet. Ethan stood up. He looked at the door through which Mia had gone for her examination. He thought about her question by the lake, whether fish knew they were in an unusual lake, and the specific wisdom of the answer he had given. Tell him I'll come to him, Ethan said. Noah Sinclair was 3 years younger than his sister, and looked more like her than he appeared to notice. He had the same bone structure, and the same habit of direct attention, and the same quality of intelligence that expressed itself as patience rather than speed. He was a cardiologist by training, and a researcher by temperament, and he had, for 9 years, been carrying the weight of a thing he knew to be true, and could not prove. He rose when Ethan walked through the door and extended his hand, and then changed his mind, and put both hands on Ethan's shoulders in the way that men sometimes do when the gesture they actually want to make is larger than the social space allows. I'm sorry it took this long, Noah said. Ethan looked at him. Show me what you have. What Noah had was complete. It was the kind of documentation that had been assembled by someone who understood how evidence was supposed to work. Not accusation, not inference, but the patient accumulation of primary sources that told a single story without requiring anyone to take anything on faith. The original trial data showed the drug's instability in patients with a specific genetic marker. David Reeves had carried that marker. The trial protocol had identified it as a flag for exclusion. The exclusion had not been honored. The authorization to proceed had been signed by a research director 3 levels below Richard Kane, but the chain of communication above that signature was documented in internal Kane Medical emails that the research coordinator had printed and kept in a folder in an apartment in Basel for 6 years. Richard Kane's name appeared 7 times in those emails. 4 of those appearances were direct authorizations. 3 of them were acknowledgments of the risk. He had known. He had proceeded. He had restructured the evidence afterward with the methodical attention of a man who understood that the difference between accountability and impunity was documentation. Ethan read everything twice. He set the folder down. He looked at the wall. He's still running trials, Noah said. Different compound, different country, same structure. There are 3 ongoing studies right now that we believe are following the same protocol: unapproved drugs, incomplete consent, exclusion criteria not honored. Children? Ethan asked. Noah's pause was its own answer. Primarily. Ethan picked the folder back up. He looked at the chain of emails for a 3rd time with the specific attention of a man who is memorizing something he intends to use. The medical board convenes its international conference in 4 days, he said. It was not a question. Here in Zurich? Noah confirmed. Richard Kane is presenting the opening keynote. The 4 days between that conversation and the board conference were not gentle days. They were the kind of days that move with the specific weight of things that cannot be postponed. On the 2nd day, Dr. Favre delivered her monitoring results. She sat across from Ethan and Mia in a consultation room, and she chose her words with the precision of a doctor who respects her patients too much to soften information into vagueness. The transplanted heart was showing signs of rejection. Not acute, not the catastrophic cascade that had killed David Reeves, but a slow accumulation of cellular damage that the monitoring study had been designed to detect. The heart that had saved Mia's life 3 years ago was beginning, at the cellular level, to lose the argument with her immune system. There were options. A revised medication protocol might slow the process. There were interventional procedures that could be attempted. But the honest conversation, the one that Dr. Favre gave them, in the quiet room with the lake visible through the window, was about timelines and probabilities and the specific shape of what the next 12 months might require. Mia listened to all of it. She sat in her chair with her hands in her lap, and her expression arranged into the gravity of a child who has learned that certain kinds of news require a steady face. When Dr. Favre finished, Mia looked at her father. What does that mean for right now? She asked. It means we're going to pay close attention, Ethan said. And we're going to do everything we can. She nodded, in the way she nodded when she was filing something. Then she asked if she could use the bathroom. When she left the room, Ethan sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he put both hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at them the way he looked at things he was preparing to solve, and the particular tremor that had begun in the cabin over the Atlantic returned to his forearms, and he did not try to stop it this time. Dr. Favre sat with him. She did not say anything, which was the right thing. After a minute, he picked up his hands and folded them together and said, "What are the parameters for a second transplant?" she told him. The parameters were what they were. The waiting list was the waiting list. The compatibility requirements were the requirements. There was a child in the third floor of the institute right now, she told him, who had been waiting for 11 months. Ethan knew about that child. He knew because Noah had told him, 2 days before, that the child's name was James Reeves, the son of David Reeves, who had died on the table 9 years ago, who had been enrolled in a drug trial without his knowledge, who had gone to his grave with his name attached to the end of Ethan Walker's career. The Reeves family's position on Ethan Walker was not ambiguous. He sat with this for the rest of that day and the night that followed. On the morning of the third day, he went to see Margaret Reeves. She was a woman in her mid-50s with the specific face of someone who has done a great deal of work to arrive at a functional relationship with grief. She was sitting in her son's room when the nurse told her someone was asking for her, and she walked into the hallway and saw Ethan and stopped completely. "You have no right to be here," she said. Her voice was very controlled. "I know," Ethan said. "I came anyway." She looked at him for a long time. "What do you want?" What he wanted was not a simple thing to ask for from a woman whose husband had died under his hands and whose son was now in a hospital room waiting for a heart. He had rehearsed various versions of the conversation and discarded all of them because they all contained, in their structure, the implicit argument that she should set aside her grief for his daughter's benefit, and he had decided that argument was one he was not willing to make. So he said instead what was simply true. "Your husband did not die because of an error I made," he said. "I know you've been told otherwise. I know that everything on record says otherwise. I've carried that record for 9 years, and I've done nothing about it because I had no proof, and I didn't think I had the right to ask for anything from your family, even with proof." He stopped. "I have proof now, and I'm not here to ask you to make a decision about Mia based on what I'm about to tell you. But I need you to know the truth. Your husband deserved to have you know it." She stood very still. He told her. All of it. The trial, the drug, the genetic marker, the emails, the research coordinator in Basel, and the folder that had been kept for 6 years in an apartment, while her family had believed that their husband and father had died because a surgeon had made a mistake. Margaret Reeves listened to all of it with the particular stillness of a person receiving information that reorganizes everything they have organized themselves around for a decade. When he finished, she did not speak for a long time. "Richard Kane," she said finally. It was not a question. "Yes." Another long silence. "James has been here 11 months, she said. "I know. He's 9 years old. I know." She looked at him with an expression he could not name because it contained too many things simultaneously, the residue of rage and the presence of grief, and something else underneath both of those. Something that had been waiting a very long time to be the right shape for the information it was now being given. "I'm not going to make a decision about my son's heart because you've told me something I can't verify yet," she said. "But I'm also not going to pretend I didn't hear it." She looked at him steadily. "If what you're telling me is true, and I find that out," she stopped. "Your daughter has nothing to do with what happened to my husband." She turned and went back into the room. Ethan stood in the hospital corridor for a moment. Then he walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby and wrote it down and sat outside by the lake for an hour without moving. The Kane Medical Group's International Medical Conference occupied a glass-fronted convention center on the eastern edge of Zurich's city center. It drew the people it was designed to draw: research directors and institutional executives, and the specific population of medical professionals for whom attendance at this kind of event was a professional obligation that dressed itself as a privilege. Richard Kane's opening keynote was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and the auditorium was at full capacity well before that hour. Noah had arranged credentials. He had done this with the methodical competence of someone who had been planning this particular day for long enough to anticipate the logistical questions. Ethan arrived in clothes that were clean and professional. He was carrying a laptop. Victoria, beside him, carried a hard drive. They took seats in the third row and waited. Richard Kane took the stage at 9:02 and was greeted with the specific applause that powerful people receive in rooms they have helped to construct. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a particular expression of command that had become so habituated as to seem natural. He had photographs and graphs and the confident architecture of a presentation that had been designed by people who are very good at design. He spoke for 15 minutes about the future of cardiac pharmacology. He used the words innovation and breakthrough with the frequency of someone who understands that repetition is its own form of evidence. He mentioned Kane Medical's ongoing research trials with pride, and with the practiced inflection of a man who does not believe he will ever be called to account for them. Then Noah walked to the stage. He had been given permission by the conference organizing committee through a process that had taken 4 days and the specific leverage of a cardiologist with an international reputation presenting a peer-reviewed finding relevant to the conference's primary topic. The committee had been told it was a research presentation. This was true. He connected his drive to the presentation system. He replaced Kane's final slide with a document. He introduced himself and then said, without any of the warm-up language that presentations usually employ, that he had new data to present regarding a clinical trial that had been conducted under Kane Medical Group's authorization 9 years earlier. Richard Kane stood at the edge of the stage. His expression did not move for several seconds. Noah spoke for 8 minutes. He cited every primary source by document number and date. He put David Reeves's genetic marker on the screen alongside the trial's own exclusion criteria. He displayed the authorization emails with Richard Kane's signature alongside the date stamps that placed them before the patient's enrollment. He did not raise his voice. He did not editorializing. He simply said what the documents said and let the auditorium arrive at its own conclusions. There was a specific quality to the silence that filled the room when Noah finished. Ethan stood up. He walked to the stage, and Noah stepped back, and Ethan took the microphone. He had not planned to speak. He had planned to be present, to be the person in the room who had been on the other side of these documents for 9 years, to let Noah and the evidence carry what they were capable of carrying. But he was standing at the front of the room, and there were 300 people in front of him, and Richard Kane was 6 feet to his right, and the thing that 9 years of silence had been waiting to resolve itself into had arrived and was ready to be said. He said it. He said it the way he had said things in the ballroom of the Grand Meridian, without theater and without performance, and without the structure of a speech. He said that he had been a surgeon and that he had loved the work with the complete investment that good work requires. He said that a man had died on his table, and that he had believed for 9 months that he might have made an error he could not identify, and that this belief had been the most useful thing the people responsible for that death could have given him. He said that he had said nothing for 9 years because he had no evidence, and that this silence had cost him things he would not attempt to enumerate in a room full of strangers, and that the cost of it was not Richard Kane's fault alone, that silence, once chosen, becomes its own kind of complicity, and that he was choosing now not to be silent. He looked at Richard Kane while he said the last part. Kane's expression had done several things during the preceding 12 minutes and had arrived at a controlled stillness that was the executive equivalent of a retreat. It held for a few seconds. Then it didn't. Kane stepped toward the microphone. He said something that began as a procedural objection and dissolved into the kind of language that emerges when a carefully constructed narrative is disassembled in public. It was not his best moment. It was, in fact, the moment that ended his professional life, because the people in that room were the people who would make the calls that moved the machinery of consequence, and they were watching. Security arrived 4 minutes later, accompanied by 2 Swiss law enforcement officers who had been briefed that morning by Noah's attorney. Kane was accompanied from the room without incident, and with a dignity that the room did not afford him, but that he was permitted to maintain because the situation was already full enough of important things, without adding theater. Ethan set down the microphone. He looked at Noah. Noah looked back at him. In the 3rd row, Victoria Sinclair sat very still, and the expression on her face was one that she had never expected to wear, in this or any room, the specific expression of someone watching the world repair something that had seemed permanently broken. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday. James Reeves's transplant committee had moved through its process with the particular urgency of a child in a declining condition and a heart that had become available with the specific timing that made every medical professional involved treat the situation with the focused gravity it deserved. Margaret Reeves had received a call from Noah 3 days after the conference. She had listened. She had sat with the call for a long time. When she spoke to Ethan, it was brief. "James needs this," she said. "That's what I know." It was not forgiveness. It was not yet ready to be forgiveness. But it was the thing that came before forgiveness, which is the recognition that the child in the next room has nothing to do with the wound in the heart. Mia's surgery was on the same day, at the same institute, in adjacent operating suites. This had been Dr. Favre's arrangement, a logistical choice, driven by the availability of a compatible heart, the timing of the donor circumstances, and the specific terrible grace of 2 children with the same urgent need and a surgical schedule that could accommodate them both. Ethan stood outside the doors of Mia's operating suite at 7 in the morning and did not go in. Dr. Favre stood beside him. She asked for you, she said. Not as pressure. As information. I know, he said. He had not operated in 9 years. He had not held a scalpel in a clinical context since the night David Reeves went to the ICU and did not come back from it. He had spent 9 years believing with the specific stubbornness of a man who organizes his self-understanding around the facts, as he has been given them, that his hands had contributed to a death, and this belief had made his hands into something he did not entirely trust. He knew now that belief had been manufactured. He knew now that his hands had not failed David Reeves. But knowledge and embodied certainty are different things, and the body learns at a different speed than the mind, and a surgeon who does not trust his hands should not use them. He stood at the door for 2 minutes. Then the door opened, and Mia looked at him from the table with her heart-shaped face and her mother's dark eyes, and the expression she wore when she had arrived at a conclusion she intended to stand behind. "Bah," she said. "I want you to do it." He looked at her. "I know that you can," she said. "You always know what to do." This was an 8-year-old's faith, which is the most complete kind of faith that exists, because it has not yet learned to hedge itself. It was not medical judgment. It was not reasoned assessment. It was simply Mia, who had been watching him her entire life, and had arrived at a conclusion that she considered final. He scrubbed in. He dressed. He took the instruments that Dr. Favre's team placed in his hands with the practiced deference of people who had read Noah's briefing document and understood who was in the room. His hands did not shake. They had shaken on the airplane, after the crisis was resolved, because the body reserves its trembling for the moments when the work is done and the adrenaline has nowhere left to go. During the work itself, the hands are steady. This had always been true. It was true now. The surgery lasted 6 hours and 40 minutes. There were 3 complications: a pressure differential that required immediate adjustment in the 4th hour, a suture tension issue in the 5th, and a prolonged moment in the 6th hour when the new heart, having been placed and connected and asked to begin its work, considered the question for 30 seconds before answering. 30 seconds is not long in ordinary time. In the 6th hour of a cardiac surgery on an 8-year-old girl, 30 seconds is a different kind of duration. Ethan stood at the table and waited, and kept his hands where they needed to be, and let the heart arrive at its own decision. Outside the operating suite, Victoria Sinclair sat in the corridor in a chair she had pulled from a waiting area and held a cup of tea that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. She did not cry until the 6-hour mark, and then she cried without making any noise, which was how she had learned to cry in the year following the accident privately, completely, without asking anyone to witness it. When Ethan walked through the doors, she looked at his face before anything else. He was tired. He was very tired, but the specific quality of the tiredness was the kind that follows completion rather than failure, and she had known him well enough once to read the difference, and apparently she still did. "She's stable," he said. His voice was unsteady in a way it almost never was. "The heart is beating." Victoria stood up. She crossed the corridor and put her arms around him, which she had not planned to do, and which he received without stiffening, leaning into it instead, slightly, like something that had been holding its own weight for a very long time and had been offered permission to briefly not. Across the building, in a room whose window looked out on the same lake, James Reeves had also made it through his surgery. His mother sat beside his bed and held his hand and looked out at the green water and said nothing, and the nothing was full of things that would take a long time to say. The weeks that followed had the texture that follows any great effort, a settling, a redistribution, a slow reorientation of daily life around the new shape of things. Mia recovered with the focused seriousness she brought to everything. She asked questions. She cooperated with the physiotherapy team with the thoroughness of a child who understands that the work has to be done and finds a specific satisfaction in doing it. She was allowed to sit by the window on the 8th day, and she looked at the lake with the expression she had worn the morning Ethan had shown it to her for the first time. And she said, "I think it's greener than before." "Your vision is sharper when you're not running on less oxygen than you need," Ethan told her. She considered this. "That's a good thing," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." Richard Kane was charged with a range of offenses under Swiss and American law. The process that follows such charges is long and resistant to compression. But the nature of the documentation Noah had assembled made the direction of the process clear to everyone who looked at it, and the people who had built professional relationships with Kane Medical on the assumption of its permanence began, with the measured precision of institutional self-interest, to revise those relationships. Ethan's medical license was restored in a proceeding that took 11 days, and was, by the standards of regulatory bureaucracy, remarkable for its speed. The licensing board cited newly available evidence and expressed, in the formal language of official communications, regret for the delay. This regret was noted and filed in the appropriate category. The offers began arriving the following week. 3 major cardiac surgery programs, 2 research directorships, a hospital network in Boston that had tracked his original work and extended an invitation that arrived with the specific weight of an institution that had made up its mind. The financial figures attached to some of these offers required Ethan to read them twice to confirm he had understood correctly. He sat with all of them at the small table in the hotel room where he and Mia were staying while her recovery continued. He read each offer carefully. In the methodical way he read everything. He made notes. He thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he declined all of them. He wrote a letter instead to Noah, to Dr. Favre, to several people in the Zurich medical community who had become part of the preceding weeks explaining what he intended to do. He wanted to establish a fund, a surgical fund, focused specifically on pediatric cardiac cases where the family did not have the resources to access the level of care required. He wanted to practice surgery, but he wanted to do it in the context of that work at institutions that served the populations that did not attract the kind of attention that comes with prestigious offers. The letter was precise and direct, and did not contain a single word of self-congratulation. Victoria read it when he showed it to her. She read it twice, in the same way he had read the offers. "You could do more if you took one of the major programs," she said. "Not as an argument, as information." "I could reach more people," he said. "That's not the same thing." She looked at him. "No," she said. "It isn't." Sinclair Biotech had a research division focused on pediatric cardiac pharmacology. This was not a coincidence. Victoria had redirected a portion of the company's research portfolio in that direction 18 months earlier, before any of the events that had brought them to Zurich, because she had spent the years since the accident thinking about what her resources were actually for, and had arrived at a set of answers that she was still in the process of implementing. The alignment between her research direction and Ethan's fund was the kind of structural alignment that does not require a long conversation to recognize. They had that conversation anyway, at length, over several evenings by the lake, because they were both people who had learned to be careful about the things that mattered to them. What grew between them in those evenings was not the resumption of something old. What had been between them a decade earlier had been real, and had been cut short by circumstances that were neither of their failures, and there was grief in it that still required acknowledgement. But they were not the same people they had been, which was not a loss. They were people who had been tested by specific and difficult things, and had come through those things with a set of capacities and a set of losses, and a clear understanding of what mattered. This understanding made conversation easy in a way that younger versions of themselves would not have been able to achieve. The afternoon light in Zurich in early December has a quality that is different from the golden October light of American parks, harder, cleaner, carrying the specific clarity of cold northern air that has not yet accumulated the weight of the longest nights. The lake holds a different color in this light, steel, blue rather than green, with a particular brightness along the surface that makes it look like hammered metal. Mia was running along the lake path in her coat with the specific energy of a child whose body has recently been given back something it had been operating without. She ran at full speed, and then circled back, and then ran ahead again, and each time she ran ahead the distance was a little greater, as though she were testing a new measurement and finding it reliable. Ethan walked beside Victoria. Neither of them had said anything for several minutes, which was one of the things they had discovered they could do without discomfort, exist in the same quiet, without either of them feeling the need to fill it. Mia circled back from a greater distance than before, and fell into step beside them for a moment, breathing hard, her cheeks red from the cold. "How far can I go before you'll worry?" she asked. Ethan looked out along the path. "Until I can't see you anymore." She considered this. "That's far. That's the point," he said. She turned and ran. Victoria watched her go. "She's extraordinary," she said. "She is," Ethan said. "She always has been." A silence. "Comfortable. Lake-shaped." "What happens now?" Victoria asked. She said it the way she said things she meant directly, without the formal architecture of a larger question. Ethan watched Mia running ahead of them along the path, getting smaller and more herself with every step, the color of her coat bright against the gray water. "Now," he said, "I get to be her father." He said this the way a man says something that has been true for a long time, and is only now arriving at the language it deserves. Not as a conclusion, as a beginning. The first clear sentence of something that had been waiting, through all the years of debt folders and truck routes and midnight arithmetic and emergency medical kits and operating rooms and conference halls and hospital corridors, to finally be said aloud in a voice that was steady all the way through. Mia turned at the far end of the visible path, saw them, and waved. Then she turned back and kept running. They walked after her in the December light.